Just thinking about, before I came to medical school, my rebellion against my parents for not going to medical school was I was a software engineer. And then I got my PhD in computer science. And because of that, when I finally got through to my medical training, I had this perception that medicine was this very logical, very deductive process, right? You go to the doctor and you say, oh, my elbow hurts. They evaluate you, they diagnose you, they tell you what's wrong with you. You do what they tell you to do and you will get better. Because why wouldn't they do that? When I actually came through and got my medical training, I realized, oh my God, that's just not how healthcare and medicine is at all. There is so much variation in the way things go. If you're one person with one disease and you showed up at 10 different hospitals, you could very easily end up with 10 different courses of treatment. Because in large part, a lot of times we actually don't really know what to do. So much of what happens is driven by our individual anecdotal experience and individual expertise. So it really should not surprise you then that the state of modern medicine is marked by this undesirable practice variability, all this variation, just by the whims of, if you're afraid of being randomized to certain treatments, well, you're already being subject to essentially the arbitrariness of whatever clinician you happen to see at any particular day. Now, to be fair, a lot of that variability is actually due to uncertainty, as I mentioned, right? Why don't you just look it up in the textbook? It's because 75% of the things we do, there's no answer. Nobody actually knows. We still have to make a call. This dirty little secret about evidence-based medicine, the vast majority of medical decisions we make, there is no good evidence to tell us what to do. Well, you might think, oh, well, that just means we just need to do more research. Do more research, eventually run enough trials, eventually we'll know the answer to everything. We'll just have like the manual for how to practice medicine. I actually believe that is fundamentally impossible given the combinatorial and dynamic nature of medicine. But let's even pretend it were possible. I think some of you are medical students. Consider that there's what this guy is doing. This is from a joke article published in the New England Journal of Medicine many years ago. What he's doing is taking the weight of the Index Medicus. This is kind of the precursor to PubMed. He does this again years later, and he laments there's an exponential growth in the weight of medical knowledge we're responsible for. And when there are over 75 randomized controlled trials and 11 systematic reviews being published every single day, I don't know about the rest of y'all, but I'm way behind in terms of keeping up with the literature. We are clearly well past the point where the complexity of modern medicine exceeds the capacity of the unaided expert mind. We've kind of limped along in medicine for many years, right? 100 years ago, there really was one doctor who could know it all and do it all, because the reality is there wasn't really that much we could do that was effective anyway. The advances in medical science is amazing how much more we know and now we can do, but it's way too much for anyone to keep track of. We've limped along through specialization and subspecialization. Hey, tell you what, I can't know everything, but I'll know everything about the heart. You know everything about the lung. You know everything about the liver. Actually, you know what? Even the heart's too complicated. I'll know everything about heart failure. You learn about heart attacks. You learn about congenital heart disease, right? We keep splintering and subspecializing to manage this cognitive overload, but then that leads to care coordination problems. A complex patient will end up with 10 different doctors, and really nobody knows what's going on because it's too hard to put that all together. What this really reflects is the fundamental scarcest resource in healthcare, or what all the healthcare reform drama is about. It's people, it's access to human expertise. And already there are over 25 million in the US alone, let alone the billions worldwide, who have deficient access to medical specialty care associated with worse outcomes. Projected by the next 10 years, we'll be short over 100,000 doctors in the US unless we do something differently. And this is based somewhat on this classical assumption that medicine depends on these in-person, one-to-one interactions. COVID is really revealing, right? We've got to find other ways to be able to deliver care to people. What I'd like to envision is what if instead we had tiers of consultative support. Like if you need to see somebody in person, if you need it, you need it. But the reality is often if I could just email another expert for advice, that would probably be enough to get me through to figure out how to help you out. Or what if we could drive towards fully automated, data-driven guides? Here I'm mocking up an example, tied to a real story. I saw a patient in clinic a while back. She said, "Oh, my heart's racing, and I think I had some hormone problem before. I did some diagnostic tests. I checked an EKG. Oh, she has sinus tachycardia. I checked her hormone levels. Oh, she has hyperthyroidism. Her hormones are out of balance. No problem. I will send you to the hormone doctor. The specialist will take care of the appropriate diagnosis and treatment. Next available appointment, 3 months from now." Like, that's crazy, right? My patient cannot wait that long for appropriate treatment. And remember, this isn't like some rural town in the middle of nowhere. This isn't a indigent, emergency Medicaid patient. This is commercially insured patient at Stanford, and it really reflects extreme imbalance of supply and demand for the most important scarce resource, which is access to professional expertise. But so I'm imagining, well, then again, it's not like I'm the first person to ever refer somebody for hyperthyroidism. What if instead we could look at the last 1,000 times that somebody ever did that, and in which case we can synthesize automatically what are those other common diagnostic tests and medications that the patient needs? Because the reality is, technically, any physician can order tens of thousands of procedures and medications. It's just that that's cognitively overwhelming to figure out what to do in that space. That general concept, though, what if we could just use the information, right? What if I could sneak a peek at the charts of other doctors to see what they figured out, but do that on a broader scale? If you think about it, that's really how market basket, crowdsourcing, clinical collaborative filtering, recommender systems work, right? So just to make sure we're on the same page, y'all know when you go to the supermarket, you can sign up for a club card. They will give you free discounts on your groceries if you do this. What are they doing that for? Like, those discounts are not free. Right? What they're doing is they're keeping track of what you're doing now over time, so they can learn your behavior and your patterns, and so they can then do very targeted advertising to you. Right? The classic story of one supermarket found that people buy beer and diapers together a lot more than you would expect by random chance. And then you can imagine putting a theory on that data. The people who are parents got to get another diaper run, might as well grab some beer while I'm here. And then you can imagine, as a market manager, you can make strategic decisions, right? Let's put all the diapers in the back of the store and put some really expensive alcohol next to it to encourage some impulse buys. If you haven't read this first article, I encourage you. It's a really interesting, compelling story about thinking about how all these things are affecting our everyday lives. So I should bring that concept to medicine, to healthcare, to let's say inpatient hospital care. Can we guess what a doctor is going to do for you next? In this case, we looked at everybody who's admitted to the hospital for chest pain. And these are all of the clinical orders that a doctor could enter that are disproportionately likely to occur within the next 24 hours. So things like, say, point of care troponin. It makes sense. That's a blood test to see if you're having a heart attack. And some association statistics, baseline prevalence. 16% of all hospitalized patients get this test at some point, but positive predictive value. Given that you're admitted for chest pain, 71% of such patients get this test. That's 14 times the odds, tiny, tiny p-value, suggests that there's something very strongly associated about this order with that situation. Other stuff like an EKG to check if you're having a heart attack, an aspirin and a clopidogrel is a treatment in case you do that. If you're not sure what's going on, a dobutamine stress echo is a way to risk stratify a patient if you're not sure what's going on with their chest pain. So things to reinforce here, I never set out to read a textbook and try to design a checklist of all the stuff you're supposed to do for somebody with chest pain or heart attack. This is all just information that just naturally is borne out by observing historical behavior of what other physicians are trying to do in these cases. So framing this as a recommendation or prediction problem over a battery of multiple prior research papers, which you're welcome to dive into more, it shows what's possible to do this analysis, right? I would never expect computers to replace a physician or even ever really to do the thinking for us. But what these types of algorithms, clinical collaborative filtering, recommender systems, right? What does a Google search, an Amazon product recommendation do for you? What they are good at is managing massive and complex information sources, right? They are able to digest this overwhelming ocean of possibilities you have to think about and digest them down to a top 10 list that then engaged human can actually interpret and apply in individual context. Right, as I mentioned, as a doctor, there are literally 10,000 things I could order for my patients. There's no way I could keep track of what all those choices are for each context. And if you were to guess at random, right, you'd be less than 2% of your things would be a hit, a correct choice. Compare that to the hospital. They already made manually curated electronic order checklists and order sets where by hand, a committee decides this is what we think is the best evidence of what people should do for chest pain. And that anticipates maybe 35% of what a patient actually gets. Compare that to these automatic data-driven algorithms, and you can automatically anticipate over 50% of what a patient needs, even without requiring additional manual intervention. So that seems pretty cool. And if anybody wants to jump in the meantime, I know it's very awkward in the Zoom environment, so I'll just keep moving along. But y'all feel pretty good about this right now? Does this seem cool? Are you ready to start deploying this? Are you worried about any ways that things could go wrong, feel free to jump in if you have any thoughts. But a very common conceit is like, hang on, wait a second. Just because Amazon recommends you a product, just because Facebook recommends you a political article to read, they just want you to buy more stuff, basically. That's not really what we're trying to do in medicine. This is really challenging, right? Because just because something is popular does not mean that it is good. This is extremely difficult to unpack in medicine because there is no gold standard to even define what good medical decision making is, right? Are we learning from the wisdom of the crowd, or are we just suffering the tyranny of the mob? It's actually a very complex topic to think about and very timely nowadays. So again, read the full research papers. We will unpack. This is a very complex, dense topic. I've dissected over multiple studies, but let's walk through some anecdotal examples to conceptually understand how this even might work. So just for fun, y'all remember TV game show, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? Answer multiple choice questions for big money. The real fun classic thing about this game show, though, was that if you're stuck, you have lifelines. You can call for help. Classic. What do? You can phone a friend. What is this? You can get on the phone, call anybody in the world you want. Who would you call? I would call my most smartest, knowledgeable, expert friend I know, who has the best chance of giving me the correct answer. I would consult a specialist, as it were. Alternatively, you can just ask the audience. This isn't knowledgeable experts. This is just regular people watching a TV game show. So how well do you think these two approaches work? It turns out if you phone a friend, that person's right like 65% of the time, way better than random. They really can help increase your chances of picking the right answer. But if you ask the audience, it turns out the audience is right over 90% of the time. Like, what on earth is going on here? It doesn't mean that 90% of the audience knew the correct answer. In this case, only 55% picked the correct answer. But what it means is that majority vote answer turned out to be right, perhaps a lot more often than you expected, much better than random, and often it can be as good at and sometimes even better than asking an individual expert. But I mean, come on, that was just like a TV game show, right? Give me a break. Is there some more fundamental principled foundation for how we think about this? Well, there is. And certainly if anybody here likes to do ensemble-based machine learning, it's the same concept. You are creating a strong classifier by aggregating the votes of many weak classifiers. You're basically finding a way to systematically reduce variance of your estimators. And indeed, there are theorems from 200 years ago explaining why would you have a jury of regular people deciding your fate? Don't you think a smart judge should be smarter? Why do we want voting democracies and not have dictators making decisions? So this theorem basically explains why conceptually that works. So simplified example, let's say it's a jury deciding a binary decision, guilty or not guilty, and nobody actually knows what the correct answer is, but they can all guess with a probability P is the probability that any one juror will pick the right answer. And this formula tells you what's the probability that the majority vote will be the correct answer in that case. And it looks familiar. That's because this is just the binomial distribution. This is flipping a coin a bunch of times and counting how many times it comes up heads. So what we have on the bottom left is a set of simulations to illustrate as long as your jurors are at least just better than random, if you aggregate the votes of more and more jurors, you're almost always expected to do better than any one person guessing. And in theory, with enough jurors, you can converge towards a perfect answer in an idealized scenario. In the right, what this is illustrating, basically this process has an amplifying effect, right? If your jurors are even just a little bit better than random, aggregating many votes will amplify that signal towards what's more likely correct. However, also be aware that what that shows that if your jurors are worse than random at picking the correct answer, you will amplify towards the wrong answer as well. I would like to think, if I'm studying physicians, we don't always know what the correct choice is, but we are offering you our best guess, and we are at least better than random, because if we weren't, like, you should just shut down the healthcare system at that point. Another interesting phenomena to think through, though, is that this wisdom of the crowd concept, it only works if there is independent thinking, which is sounds like a strange oxymoron. So what's happening in this case? In the simulation on the right, I did the same thing. A juror has a probability P that they pick the right answer, but that's only their prior baseline probability. But now this time the jurors vote in sequence. I was going to say 60% chance that this is the answer, but you know what? I'm also going to look at like how's everybody else voted so far, because I don't want to be an outlier. I don't want to seem weird if everybody else is doing something else. If it turns out if you do that, then it's still better than random, still better than one person voting, but you don't quite converge towards a perfect answer, right? Because of the first handful of people, either through just random chance or through some systematic bias, are favoring the incorrect choice. You can get stuck in these positive feedback loops where you just can't get out of it, where everyone just starts to follow each other rather than thinking independently. So that was a lot of like offline statistical analysis, which a lot of research is going to be like. But eventually, if you want to make an impact, you have to like put something in front of people if you actually want to change behavior. So what we're showing here, these are screenshots from a user interface prototype I put together to have a doctor pretend like they're working with the electronic medical record, entering in orders for simulated patients. And this is what we did. We sat them down for 5 simulated cases and said, just pretend like you're taking a patient, pick the right medicines, pick the right diagnostic test for them. The unique thing, though, is here we can also offer them customized recommendations as they work. If you know nothing about the patient, this is just the top 10 list, the generic bestseller, most common things that happen in the hospital. Metabolic panels, complete blood counts. It's just common stuff that everybody gets in the hospital, basically. What if I manually search? This is just typical EMR functionality. Spiro, because I'm looking, here we go, spironolactone. This is a hormone medicine. It's good for patients with heart failure and liver failure to kind of help control their symptoms. What happened now is I kind of added that to my shopping cart, as it were. Given that you've ordered spironolactone, this list in the middle, these are the things that are most likely to occur within the next 24 hours. And on the right are things that are disproportionate likely, such as, say, furosemide. Oh, that's a good medication. It's actually, I want that one. It's a diuretic to help you pee out extra fluid. It's a good balancing factor for the spironolactone. Now, given these two pieces of information, the system juggles the list and it says, hey, maybe you want carvedilol, digoxin, isosorbide dinitrate. Oh, those are heart failure medications, basically, right? Or how about rifaximin? Oh, actually, my patient has hepatic encephalopathy. They have confusion due to their liver disease. Rifaximin is a treatment for that. The system juggles the list again. Now lactulose, zinc, propranolol starts to float to the top of the list because those are treatments for complications of liver disease, while the heart failure stuff starts to get pushed down because they seem to be less relevant. So a couple things to point out here is note that at no time did I ever type in the words, let alone pick the ICD-10 code for liver disease or encephalopathy, right? I'm just taking care of my patient. I'm just ordering the medications and tests, the things I was going to have to do anyway to take care of them. But shouldn't our systems be able to automatically observe what we're doing, infer the patient context, and anticipate what we need without even having to be asked for it? It really should be possible because it's not like this is the first time this has ever happened. You know, did I review a textbook to curate some rules on how this should work? Well, no, I mean, that's very laborious and very brittle. Maybe I hired a dozen doctors to manually review 10,000 patient charts and annotate them with what the correct diagnosis and treatment plan were. I could, but actually I can't because I can't afford to do that. That's very laborious and expensive. Except maybe I don't have to do that, right? Because what do we as clinicians do? We're essentially an army of manual annotators working every single day to review our patient charts and annotating them with what we think the correct treatment and diagnosis and management is, reflected in our clinical orders, the concrete manifestations of our clinical decision making. When we, so actually Rocky was involved. It was the key statistical analyst here for this study. We just published in JAMIA just last week. That's a great concept, but what happens if you actually put this in front of real doctors? How do they behave? Maybe they'll hate it. Maybe they'll be annoyed at more user interface that they have to interact with. Alert fatigue is a very common problem in medical processes. Or maybe, I don't know, just like Amazon recommends you nonsense and Facebook just, tilts your political views in an echo chamber and you don't realize that. Maybe if you put recommender systems in front of doctors, they'll start making terrible choices. So these were key things we wanted to understand. Sat 43 doctors down at the system, 5 simulated cases randomized to whether this recommender system was turned on. And we found in a survey, over 90% of the physicians involved, they thought the tool would be very useful and would help make their job better. And indeed, even though it was strictly optional to use the recommender, still they used it in over 95% of the cases, even though they never had to, reflecting that it was giving them useful suggestions. They actually wanted to use it. To evaluate quality, or at least clinical appropriateness, what we did is we got together a panel of expert clinicians, and they reviewed every case, and they came to a consensus score for all the different things a doctor do. So you could not just say what tends to happen, but like grade them basically and how good the quality and appropriateness of their medical decision making is. And with the recommender on, it actually seems like, if anything, maybe they even did a little bit better, but countered by they also maybe did a little bit more. So at least on the average, it was similar, but certainly kind of lends no support to the fear that suddenly doctors will make terrible decisions much worse if you give them data-driven algorithms, even though it does seem scary, right? Where did this recommendation come from? Some computer came with it. It sounds ominous for many people, but this study does not support that finding. Other concerns you might have, they'll say, hey, wait a second. You know, Amazon just wants you to buy more stuff. If you just recommend stuff to doctors, is that just going to make them waste more money, basically? They'll order a bunch of extra tests and medications that maybe don't actually matter. This really is important to think about. This probably can happen, and based on our study, that it seemed a little bit true, right? They tended to order a little bit more stuff, even though it was appropriate things. So that's what we're thinking about, and especially in your generation, you got to think about it still hasn't been solved. Healthcare reform is going to be a huge issue next year and for the next 10 to 20 to 50 years. And the key issue is that there's this fundamental tension in the iron triangle of quality, cost versus access. Every time you think you're trying to make something better by pulling in one of these directions, just be aware you've almost certainly broken something on the other side. And it kind of has to be this way because, again, there's a fundamental scarce resource, and the scarcest resource is access to a human expert, right? You know, I'll go see 20 patients in clinic tomorrow. Oh, there's like 30 people waiting in line. There's a 3-month waiting list. Okay, fine. I'll see 30 patients in clinic tomorrow. That's not enough. I'll see 40, 50. Like at some point, I just physically can't get to more patients in a day and still provide safe quality care, right? So this is this fundamental scarce resource, which you have to make choices about, and why we have to have political dogfights about who's going to get more and who's going to get less and who's going to pay for it. In my probably naive but optimistic view of how to break out of this cycle, there's basically only 2 approaches. One is you create supply, right, to reduce that scarcity, such as through automation, such as through this kind of data-driven decision support systems to expand reach and access. The other approach would be to systematically identify and eliminate fraud, waste, and abuse, and other inefficiencies in the system. Consider, for example, how can we advance the efficient frontier? Estimates that currently up to 1/3 of the $3 trillion we spend on healthcare every year essentially waste, right? It's services, administrations, prices that don't actually help any patients. It's, you know, no wonder that people are looking for emerging technology, intelligent system, some way to help us make better use of the scarce resources we have to take care of more people more effectively. And so it turns out greater 200 billion dollars per year of this is essentially underneath tests and procedures, the largest volume being laboratory diagnostic testing, with estimates that maybe up to half of the hospital laboratories we do are not actually necessary. It's just stuff to keep ourselves busy. It's just something we get to look at and like draw your blood every day and just see what numbers come out, even though they're probably not making a difference in a lot of patients' care. So a slightly different thread of work. Rather than recommending stuff that a doctor could do, could we also predict things that you don't need to do? It's another way to think about it. So in this line of work, it's really going to come down to, can you predict the value of a diagnostic test before you've even ordered it? And this is really going to come down to, can you estimate the pre-test probability of tests? So make sure you understand all those concepts: pre, post-test probability, sensitivity, specificity, odds ratios, all this stuff, and how it plays into diagnostic decision making. So this is the core framework of how you think about it. If this line from 0 to 100%, that's the probability that you think somebody has some disease or diagnosis or the outcome of a test, for example. If it's very close to 0%, you should just move on, right? It's so unlikely. Like, I could test any one of you right now for a heart attack, but why do I do that? It's so unlikely you have it. It's just a waste of time, right? It's a non-zero chance that you do, but it's so low, it's just not worth pursuing. You should just move on. And the other extreme, let's say I'm so certain, very close to 100%, that it's so likely that you have a diagnosis or an outcome. there's no reason to do a test again. You should just start treatment. You should just act as if. It's so likely. Even if you looked at a test, it's more likely to be a false negative. You wouldn't trust it anyway. It's technically really only in the middle area of uncertainty where it is worth doing diagnostic tests or running prediction and risk models so that you can move your pre-test to a post-test probability that pushes you past either the threshold to test or the threshold to treat. So we tried doing this for a bunch of inpatient laboratory tests, and it becomes very easy to find things where like it just doesn't make sense why we're doing this. Here, the bars represent the total volume of these common tests being done. The black parts represent how often is that test a repeat of the exact same test within 24 hours. And there'll be things like your albumin levels, your hemoglobin A1C, a marker of your long-term diabetes control. Like that doesn't, it's not even biologically plausible that those values could change that quickly. And so any one of these repeats that quickly could just represents a mistake. Like that just shouldn't be done. How about the other trends, right? A very common thing that we do in the hospital, we order daily labs. Every morning, somebody's gonna come at 5 a.m., stick you for some blood and just check a complete blood count and metabolic panel just as a routine thing to look at. So let's look at purple, hemoglobin, it's a measure of your blood density. If this is the first hemoglobin being checked in somebody in the hospital, only 10, 15% of them are normal. There's a lot of abnormal results. Everybody has anemia. They have low blood counts when they come to the hospital because they're just usually sick. So in that case, it's worth it. You should check that test. Very likely to be abnormal. Go check it and assess how bad it is to make a judgment about what to do. However, if you've repeated 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 hemoglobins in a row over the course of a week and every one has been normal, the sixth one is not 15% chance of being normal. It's greater than 80%, 90%. It's rapidly converging towards the last 6 times this has been normal. Like, what's the value in checking it again a 7th time in a row? There's a diminishing return, diminishing yield of new information that can be expected in terms of these predictable phenomena. So that's a framework to think about, but there's not just repetition. If you've repeated a test before, that makes it obvious. But also, what if I know your age, I know your gender, I know your prior diseases, I know what medications you're on, I know what laboratory results you had before, I know your vital signs. What if we port all of this into standard machine learning algorithms? What if there are other ways that diagnostic testing results could be predictable based on the information that's already readily available? So we did that for a battery of many common inpatient laboratory tests and expanding this in other implementation ways. But here's just an example. Many very common tests done in the hospital. The top bar, the whole length of the bar represents the entire volume of testing for magnesium, a level of electrolyte in your blood. And everything to the left of the bar represents the volume that one of our algorithms would have predicted. This could be positive. So if you want to order the test, you should probably just order the test because it's probably going to be abnormal. You might want to check it out. Everything to the right of the midline represents cases where this algorithm's tuned to a 95% negative predictive value. It predicts even before you've ordered the test. I'm pretty sure this test is going to be normal. It's not going to show anything interesting. Even before you've ordered the test, the green bar represents how often that's right, tuned to be about 95% correct. Implies that there's a very large volume of these tests that are basically low yield, right? There's very little information gain. It was very predictable what the result was going to be even before you did it, begging the question, why do we even bother doing that diagnostic testing? If you think through that, y'all feel good about that? Anything you can think about, wait a second, I'm not sure that works in all cases, because you should. Particularly in medicine, just beware, low information is kind of an information theory. It's a statistical to numerical concept, but low information does not equal low importance. A very classic challenge in medicine and healthcare is that you have to consider very unlikely events that are catastrophically bad if you miss them, right? There can be these extreme risk-benefit ratios where a false positive can be hurt a lot less than a false negative. But by that token, I don't know if you ever heard this concept. Well, just order a test. It never hurts to get more information. So check that thing just in case. This comes up a lot when you're making medical decision making. And with reasonable reason based on what I just talked about, right? But worth really breaking down this concept. Otherwise, we'll be stuck in this trap. Imagine if your patient, I wonder if they have sepsis, I wonder if they have a bloodstream infection. There's bacteria in their blood, the #1 killer in the hospital. would you do? You can order these blood culture bottles. You take a sample of their blood, you stick it in a culture media and see if any bacteria grow out of them. And if somebody has that bad infection, like, you don't want to miss that. That would be really bad, right? You have to be super sure you catch it if it's there. Even if it's not likely, you better really be sure you look for it. And in fact, consider that you actually don't care about the results of what the test, what the culture bottle shows. What you care about is, does your patient have a bloodstream infection or not? The test, the culture bottle, is itself only correlated with that real patient state. It is imperfectly sensitive. And so, in fact, the standard of care is you don't order one blood culture test, you order a set of 4 blood culture bottles. That's the normal standard of care, because each one is imperfectly sensitive. Let's repeat it multiple times to increase our sensitivity, our chance of catching this really bad thing we don't want to miss. Okay, I mean, that could be fair, but now here's a question for you. Why did you stop at 4 blood culture bottles? Why not check 5? Why not check 6? Why not check 12 blood culture bottles? In fact, if you were somebody had infectious endocarditis, a heart valve infection, that's what we would do. You would order 12 blood culture bottles, because that's really bad. You'd really better not miss that. You got to really be sure and make sure you have very good sensitivity. But by that direction of logic, why don't we order 50 blood culture bottles, right? So here's the general framework to think through. The reason you don't order the 50th blood culture bottle is because, given the results of the last 49 blood culture bottles, the result of the 50th one is highly, highly predictable. It is very unlikely to give you new information. Even though there is a non-zero chance that the 50th blood culture bottle will reveal something that you didn't already see in the prior 49, it's such diminishing returns that at some point it is no longer worth, the information gain is so little, it is not worth pursuing any further. And the general framework I'm thinking is, it's not just repetition, other contextual features you have about the patient, all the data you have on them from every direction, you can make more precise estimations about what to do and what's worth pursuing. And the last kind of section here, kind of changing gears, we're trying to think about other ways you can use these types of concepts. What if you could predict the value of diagnostics in the vax to make a better, more precise choices? So this is summarized some work that another one of our biomedical informatics star students, Connor Corbin, has been working on personalized antibiograms. So let's set the stage a little bit here. Y'all may not realize, and we certainly understand about like viral pandemics now, that's clearly the lead story for this year and the next year. 5 years from now, it'll probably pass, but what's still emerging, huge threats to our public health. Realize y'all take it for granted. Like, I think every one of us does. We don't even realize we were born into the era of antibiotics. It was not that long ago, less than 80 years ago, that there were diseases that nowadays we would just cure in a few days, that 100 years ago just would have wiped out entire populations. We didn't have any treatment for them. There have been laments, though, because a very natural consequence of antibiotics use for infections is that it naturally selects for resistance. Naturally, bacteria will learn to become resistant to any antibiotic use. This is a normal biologic phenomenon that's going to happen. And so there have been anxiety, like, what if we use our antibiotics too much and one day we end up in a post-antibiotic era? We take for granted we can cure diseases, we can do complex surgeries, give people chemotherapy, and it's because we have antibiotics to manage infections. What if we got to a day where the antibiotics stop working? The scary thing is, actually, we're already here. We've already arrived. In this case from 2016, the CDC reported a woman, she came from India, where they have a lot of these resistant infections. She had a bad hip infection. The bacteria that grew out of the infection, resistant to every single commercially available antibiotic. There was nothing available to treat it. And so, not surprisingly, a week later, she succumbed to septic shock and died because there was no therapy to offer her. Already, the CDC tracks over a dozen different antibiotic-resistant bacteria and other related infections that pose serious public health threats. And there's every reason to believe these will all just get worse. It's just a matter of time. These all get worse. Estimates are by 2050, resistant bacteria will kill more people than kill cancer. And again, this was all very predictable. Alexander Fleming invented penicillin, got the Nobel Prize, and just caution, like, this is a very predictable phenomena. Beware that the thoughtless person who uses antibiotics inappropriately is morally responsible for the death of the next patient who succumbs to an infection from a resistant organism. I mean, so how do we get there? I mean, why is this so hard to deal with? It's because how do you make decisions about who do you give antibiotics to? The benefits, if it works, are immediately invisible. You know the patient gets better. And the harms of like maybe side effects and maybe secondary infections, maybe public health resistance, it's very delayed and nebulous. And so doctors get stuck in this situation where you see a sick patient in front of you. Maybe they have a bad infection, maybe they don't. And what kind of infection is it? I need to know what, if they have an infection, what's causing it, what's the bug, and what drug, what antibiotic should I use? Because a whole plethora, a whole panel that we could use. And you don't want to use big ones. You want to use narrow ones when you can to be precise. But when somebody's sick, you don't know. So you use a big shotgun of an antibiotic usually. Broad spectrum antibiotics. Why can't we just do a test? Just tell us which one to do. We can. We have very good diagnostic tests. We have blood cultures, urine cultures, where we grow the bacteria in the laboratory and we can tell exactly what species and exactly what antibiotics that work on them. But it's a 3-day turnaround to get that information. You can't wait that long to start treatment. So you have to make empiric choices about how to prescribe antibiotics for patients, which is really a nice way of saying we guess. I wonder if this patient has this. We guess what are the likely bugs and drugs to use. But that's actually a pretty good framework if anyone's thinking about any projects in this or related areas. When is it worth it to build a prediction model for something in healthcare or anywhere? Think about things that they have to be actionable, arbitrary, and ascertainable. There is a viable, important decision that somebody has to make, like which antibiotic should I choose, which currently depends on a variable human prediction's ability to predict the future. I think it'll be Staph aureus. No, maybe it'll be E. coli. I'm actually not sure, right? A human has to guess, which means that invariably there is variability, be undesirable variability in our consistency to do that effectively. But yet still there's ultimately a verifiable correct answer that whatever you predict, you will find out if you're right or wrong. You can get feedback. So for example, should you predict, everybody's got these deterioration indexes in hospitals now. Guess who's gonna die so you can deploy more attention, I guess. Should you predict who's gonna die if they're already terminal, if they're already in the intensive care unit? You could, but it's kind of like, what's the point? Yes, they're high risk of death. I mean, we already knew that. How is that actionable? What could we do that we weren't already doing? This is the most common mistake people do when they develop prediction projects. How about say, I wonder if we could predict whether we should give oxygen to somebody who has low oxygen levels, like somebody who has maybe COVID or something. You could, but again, why bother? That's really not that arbitrary. That's not that variable. You don't need to predict if somebody's oxygen is low. You just measure it. You'll just know. There's really not that much variability that you need to predict anything. I wonder, I'm about to prescribe a bottle full of opioids, some Vicodin or something, or oxycodone for a patient, but I'm also worried this patient might just go out and sell this on the street instead. Could you predict whether that's going to happen? So then I might change the way I prescribe. That would be really cool if you could do that, but I don't see how that could possibly work, because how could you ever ascertain that? How could you ever find out whether or not your prediction was correct or not? You can't get the feedback to actually build a prediction model effectively. Instead, think about how do you allocate a scarce resource or a risky treatment, right? If you have a liver transplant you want to give to somebody, but there's 10 people in line, can you predict who's the highest risk of death so you can prioritize who to get to first? That's a real application right now. If somebody has atrial fibrillation, their Apple Watch told them that they have, are they at risk for getting a stroke from that? If so, maybe I could prevent that stroke with a blood thinner, but a blood thinner is also dangerous too. So is it worth it to give that blood thinner? If you could predict for me how risky, how likely is that patient to have a stroke in the next year, I can weigh the risks and benefits more effectively. These are the kinds of things where it does make more sense to have risk and prognostic examples drive your decision making. All right, so let's wrap up this antibiotic example. So what we're showing here is over time. Here I did a trend with Connor on every bacteria that grew out of blood cultures in patients at Stanford Hospital. So they had these really bad infections, and where the empiric treatment that somebody gave at the time that they did the blood culture, they gave them Zosyn, piperacillin tazobactam, this very big giant shotgun of an antibiotic. It's easier to describe what it doesn't treat than what it does treat because it's so big. And the reason people give it is like, I don't know, the patient looks sick. I'm just going to give them this big shotgun because I don't know. I'm afraid of picking something too narrow. And then eventually the cultures did give us the final answer. Was the bug that grew actually resistant or sensitive to this antibiotic? And in the red curve, second one, you can see piperacillin tazobactam. It's pretty effective, but actually 5 to 10% of the time, the bug turned out to be resistant even to this big shotgun antibiotic, implying that we're missing, implying that we actually should have given a bigger antibiotic in some of those cases. But also what it shows is in many cases, even something as tiny as ampicillin, old antibiotic, 40% of the time, we could have given that smaller antibiotic and it would have worked just as well. But the problem is we just didn't know which 40% it was, right? Well, how about, again, prediction models, right? Use all the patient's prior antibiotic use, prior cultures, prior comorbidities, medications are on. Feed those into prediction models. And what this precision recall curve on the right, I'll just summarize to say, is what it's showing is if you just prescribe Zosyn, Pip-Tazo, 8% of the time you'd be wrong, but 90+% of the time you'd be fine. There is at least a quarter of these cases in the orange box reflected where it's not 8% chance you're wrong, it's 30% chance you're wrong. That's too high a risk. You should probably pick a bigger antibiotic to make sure those patients are covered. On the left here is similar, but invert the scenario. Here are cases where the box is reflecting patients who got the Zosyn, but it was predictable that a smaller antibiotic, ceftriaxone, would have worked just as well as Zosyn would in general, implying that, again, you can't do it for everybody, but can you make precision selections? For this subgroup of patients, they're at low enough risk where this other thing would have worked just as well and make better use of our scarce resources, right? I'm just mindful of the time, but just to very briefly summarize, the histograms on the right are basically showing the distribution, how often we prescribe different common antibiotics when somebody comes to our emergency department, and how often we miss, how often we undershoot what the person actually needed. Compared to the bottom, if things had been driven based on our precise algorithms that Connor had developed, we could have used smaller antibiotics, conserve them more effectively to protect resistance, and yet we would end up with an even less miss rate. We would actually take better care of patients using less resources in that case. All right, I'll wrap it up here. So great to talk with everybody. I hope to connect with you in person one day, or at least virtually in the meantime. And to summarize, the broad themes of interest that I'm interested in and would love to discuss are how do you crack this iron triangle of quality, cost, and access, which to me means automated consultation, identifying inefficiencies, to manage this overwhelming complexity of modern medicine, thinking that data science and clinical decision support innovations are ways that can empower our most important resource in medicine, which is people, to provide better care that is scalable and reach responsiveness and reproducibility. I'll wrap it up there. Thanks, everybody.